Hello, welcome to workshop number 3, Housing Market in the South Africa, the case study of Cape Town. Our speaker for this workshop is Mr. Rob McGaffin, founding member of the Urban Real Estate Research Unit, University of Cape Town.
Right, just checking that you can see my presentation.
Yes, I can.
Great. Well, good afternoon, everybody, and thank you very much, Ali, for the invitation to do this presentation. This afternoon, I'm going to be focusing on the housing market in Cape Town. It is specific to Cape Town, but I think, as we'll see, a lot of the issues that I highlight, I think, are applicable pretty much to any city, I think, in Sub-Saharan Africa, or actually across the entire continent. In fact, probably anywhere in the globe. Across the globe, I was reading an interesting article about housing issues in Berlin, in Germany, and a lot of the same issues seem to come up there as well. So we'll just use Cape Town as the case study to unpack some of those issues. And really, it's about trying to unpack a methodology or a way of looking at these issues and understanding these housing markets. So the title is why is the housing market broken? But then with the question mark, is it actually broken? Because I think we'll see that the markets are actually quite resilient, although we can improve them. So usually what we do when we look at these type of problems is we try to start with a problem statement. And in my view, a problem statement's got two aspects to it. One is the symptom of the problem. And often in housing, we normally speak about that in terms of the lack of housing, the backlogs, etc., which I think is important because it gives one an indication of the scale of the problem. But I don't think that is sufficient in terms of addressing the problem. You actually need to understand the underlying causes behind the problem as well. So the second part of the problem statement is looking at what are the causes. And that's what I'm going to spend quite a lot of time looking at this afternoon. But just to give us some context around the symptoms, if you looked at Cape Town, we've got about 1.2 million households. We've got a close on about 900,000 formal houses registered, giving us a backlog of somewhere around 300. It's between 300 to 400,000 houses is what the backlog looks like. We're estimating that household growth is around close to 2% per annum, but we're only delivering about 1% of the new housing stock, is 1% of the existing stock. So clearly we've got a problem where the graphs are going in the wrong direction. We've got our household growth is happening a lot faster than our housing growth. And we're needing to address that. We're needing to deliver somewhere in the region of about 40,000 units per annum to catch up, and we're nowhere near that. So the question one has to ask then is why not? There's clearly a need for housing. There's clearly a demand for housing, and I use that word demand quite carefully. I'm not sure we have the effective demand, but there's clearly a need for housing. But the market does not seem to be responding in a sufficient way to deal with this problem. And the hypothesis or proposition that we're putting forward here is because the value versus cost equation is wrong. And what I mean by that is that no rational developer, and when I say a developer, in our view, somebody who owns a house and just extends their house, puts a room on their house, we would classify as a developer as much as we would classify somebody who builds 500 or 1,000 houses, etc. But we're saying that no one will look to develop a housing unit if the value of that unit upon completion, what somebody is prepared to pay for it, is less than what it costs them to build. And that's where we have a problem at the moment, is that the cost is higher than the value. And really, if we look at, you could look at that in different ways, but to give you an idea, one metric that we use is we look at the yields, the rental yields that we get from a development versus the cost of finance. And for residential units in Cape Town, you'd be quite lucky to get a yield of between 5 and 7%. but your cost of finance, and I'm talking about your average cost of finance over the period of the loan, is somewhere between maybe it's dropped slightly now, but it's probably 9% upwards. Although at the moment we have historically low interest rates, I believe that this is not a long-term trend, and that the long-term trend is probably sitting around about, you know, your 10 to 12%, etc. So your costs are at 12%, your returns are sitting at 6 or 7%, and so we have this imbalance. So what we then need to understand is we need to understand the two sides of this equation. We need to understand the value side, and we need to understand the cost side. And if we look at the drivers of value, on the one level, it's driven by income, what people are able to pay for something, and especially in South Africa and a lot of places across the continent, we know that we have low incomes in our cities, and that obviously which reduces the value, therefore, of these properties. However, we also have a situation where value is pushed up where there's a lack of supply into particular markets. And so in South Africa, in our middle and upper markets, the lack of supply into those markets, or insufficient supply into those markets, has pushed these values up. And I'll show you what the implications of that are a bit later on. But until recently, sort of pre-COVID, in Cape Town, we saw dramatic house price increases in the middle and upper income segments of the market. So basically, that I was just explaining on the previous slide there, is what the case is. And just to give you an illustration, though, of the challenge that we face with respect to the income levels in Cape Town, is that it costs about sort of open market house in Cape Town, sort of the lowest open market house in Cape Town. It's about 400,000 Rand, plus minus, maybe slightly less, etc., somewhere around there. Which you would need to have a household income of about 20,000 Rand. However, about 70% of all households in Cape Town earn less than that amount. So there is insufficient buying power to create the value needed to overcome the cost of generating those houses. And you can look at it from an ownership perspective, and you can also look at it from a rental perspective. Again, if you look at households allocating about 25% of their household income towards rental, and if you're looking at a 20,000 Rand household, well, that's somewhere around 5,000 Rand a month that people are able to allocate towards rental. But if you look at your average housing rental market in Cape Town, you know, your rental prices are a lot higher than that. And just as an illustrative way, I just did this, is not a particularly scientific exercise, but I just went online a little while back and looked at the rental properties in Cape Town. And at that particular point in time, there was over 3,000 properties available to rent, and only 19 were available beneath 5,000 Rand a month. This is in your formal rental market. So obviously there is a separate market happening in the city as well, which is more informal, but your formal market is not generating enough rental housing at that affordability level that most people have. Again, I said to you then, on the top end of the market, we have values being pushed up because of a scarcity. We're not supplying sufficient middle and upper income housing into the market as well. And again, to illustrate this point, we have about 240 households that earn more than 20,000 Rand a month, right? And if we're looking at a growth rate of around 1.5% per annum, we are producing an additional 3,600 households every year into this market. So the growth in households in this market is over 3,500 households a year. However, we are only building about just over 1,500 new houses in this market segment. So there's a shortfall of, I've estimated, of approximately 2,000 houses per annum. So I always make the point, we don't just have an affordable housing problem in Cape Town, we have a housing problem in Cape Town. And I think it's very important to understand all your housing markets and your sub-markets, because they actually interact with each other. So if there's a problem in one, there's often a spillover into the other housing markets. And I'll illustrate to you how that has taken place in Cape Town. If we move across then to the cost side of the equation, is that if you look at the breakdown of the cost structure of building a house, a significant percentage of that cost, as in the direct building costs, obviously the other costs associated are land, your professional fees, etc., etc. But a significant part is your construction costs themselves. And if you break down those construction costs into these different elements, you'll see that you've obviously got your substructure, your foundations, etc., your superstructure, which is your frames, etc., and then your services, your fittings, and your finishes. Now, your services, substructures, and superstructure are very similar whether you're building a middle-income house or whether you're building a lower-income house. The differences really come in the fittings and the finishes and the size of the house. Obviously, often your middle income house will be your larger house, let's say, but your fittings and your finishes really are where you distinguish between the two. However, the rentals you're able to receive from a middle income house compared to a low income house are significantly higher, but your costs are not significant. Well, let me put it in the other way. The rentals you can receive from a lower income house are significantly lower than a middle income house. But your costs are not significantly lower. And so you have this imbalance that takes place there. And hence we see why a lot of developers therefore operating in your middle and upper markets as opposed to the lower end. So what we need to then understand, we need to understand what are the drivers of these costs. And construction costs, the direct construction costs. In South Africa, we haven't seen significant increases. Obviously, you do have your increases and your escalations that take place over time, but they're not completely out of kilter. But what we have found in South Africa is that our construction industry is in trouble. So you just need to open some newspapers in South Africa and you see the number of construction companies that are either in liquidation, under new management, etc., etc., etc. So we're having a less and less competitive construction market in South Africa, I think, as a result. We don't have enough players in that space at this point in time. Increasingly also with our currencies, where we have a lot of our materials that perhaps need to be imported, etc. And if we have our volatile currencies, etc., we obviously sometimes run into problems from an exchange rate point of view. What the graph at the bottom here shows is what we've done is we've tracked the increase in house prices and building costs, direct building costs over time. And we've gone back to about 1960s odd, and we tracked it all the way through to about 2016, 17. And what you could see is that there was quite a close correlation between house prices and construction costs. So direct construction costs were obviously having an impact on your house prices. And then in around about 2000, 2002, we started to see a divergence taking place between that. In the sense that these prices seem to be driven by other factors other than your direct construction prices. So what we've then looked at, we said, well, if it's not your direct construction prices that are driving those things, as we saw earlier on, they're increasing somewhere around inflation, or maybe sometimes even less than inflation at times, there must be other factors that are driving these costs. And what we found is actually it's the non-construction costs that seem to be having such a big impact on the cost of developing houses. And really, there are really sort of four main areas, or sort of 4 to 5 main areas where that's the case. One is land, cost and availability of land, the development process, just the time that it takes to get a project off the ground, etc. In certain cases, we have incredibly high building standards that have to be complied with. When I talk about standards, I talk about fire and safety, I talk about parking, I talk about all those sort of associated standards, etc. There's obviously infrastructure costs. I'm not sure there's anywhere on the continent where there is not a strain on the infrastructure and infrastructure problems. And then increasingly, there are increasing operating expenses to run these buildings going forward as well. If we break down some of those and we go and look at those specifically, because these are the areas that we need to address. This is where we need to intervene to address this cost versus value equation. And let me just stop there for a moment before I go on with respect to these non-construction factors. On the value side of the equation, we're not going to change that easily because that is driven primarily by people's incomes. It's people's earning power. It's what people can afford to pay for something. Now, that is a massive structural issue in most countries. It's about levels of education, it's about levels of employment, it's about the state of the economy, etc., etc. That is not going to change particularly quickly or easily. So that value part of it is we kind of stuck there. That's the number we got to play with. So what we've got to do is we've got to look at our interventions happening on the cost side of the equation. And that's why it's important to go and break down these costs into their elemental parts and understand where can we intervene to bring down those costs. So if you look at those sort of 5 key areas that I spoke about in the previous slide and start with land, we can see that one of the problems why the land prices are so high is because, remember I said to you, in the middle and upper markets, there's a scarcity factor, and that's pushing up the prices of houses. And the price of land is a residual of what the house price is. In other words, developers will pay more for the land, the higher the value they can sell that house for, etc. And so there's a scarcity factor there, it pushes up these land prices as a result. Secondly, and this is the key one around, is what I call the land production process, taking a piece of land to the point that you can start the construction on it. And really that, to me, has got 3 aspects to it. It's gaining access to it, some sort of control over that land, whether that's through a land availability agreement, a sale agreement, a long lease, whatever it might be. The acquiring or ensuring that there's adequate infrastructure that you can tap into, that your project can tap into. Now, in South Africa, we have quite a lot of constraints on our bulk infrastructure, so increasingly these projects are being asked to pay for that bulk infrastructure, and that pushes up the price or pushes up the cost. And lastly, the complexities of acquiring the development rights. Now I mean that from your zoning, your environmental approvals, your heritage approvals, etc., etc. And if you put all of that together, what's happening is we have increasingly high land prices, especially in places such as Cape Town. This is just a couple of graphs to illustrate the complexities of acquiring those rights and what happens in that development process, and why in Cape Town it is. And I don't expect you to see the detail here, and I just want you to highlight the complexities and the numerous steps and hoops, etc., that developers have to climb through to get these rights, etc. But the long and the short of it is that it's taking us somewhere between 6 and 9 years to get a project off the ground. And I think in Ali's, one of his earlier slides, actually, I think he actually indicated something similar along those lines in similar time frames. Now, you can understand, if you are financing this project through borrowings, just the holding costs associated with these projects is huge. And we've done some initial calculations, and we're sort of saying for every year that a project is delayed or takes longer to get to completion, you reduce the affordability of that project between 15 and 20%. So your ability to service the more affordable market becomes harder and harder the longer that project takes. The other issue in South Africa that we have a lot of is we have particularly high standards, building standards that have to be complied with. Now, on the one level, this is a good thing. We need to ensure that our buildings are safe and that people don't get injured, etc. in those buildings. But I think we need to strike a happy balance somewhere between there, because if those standards result in the properties becoming unaffordable, well, all it means is that households then move into the informal market where no standards exist whatsoever. So I'm saying we need to strike a happy balance when it comes to what standards we impose on these projects. The infrastructure story, I have spoken about this a little bit earlier. Historically, what's happened is over time in South Africa, our local governments are becoming increasingly reliant on the national government to provide grant funding to deliver infrastructure projects. The problem is that because of the low economic growth at national level, our tax revenues, etc., are down, and the ability of national government to actually pay for infrastructure at a local level is becoming more and more constrained. And hence, municipalities are having to look at far more innovative ways of actually financing infrastructure at a local level. And I think there are opportunities out there where we can use a lot more land-based financing techniques to deliver infrastructure at the local level, because you cannot put that entire cost onto a project, because it just then actually makes that project unaffordable. And then lastly, we've seen increasingly over time rapid increases in operating expenses as well, which then have to be incurred by these projects. So as a result, what is happening is that the market is not responding to the demand for housing at an adequate level. And in that sense, you could argue that, yes, the market is broken. We have market failure in that place. The reason why that market failure is occurring is, as I said to you, I believe it's because the value versus cost equation is going the wrong way. The costs are higher than the value of the property. And so what we're needing to do, as I said, is to actually bring down the cost side of the equation to balance out that equation. However, I've always been amazed at how resilient markets are and how markets respond as well. And so the question is the market actually completely broken or not? So let's see how the market has been responding to these challenges that I've highlighted earlier on. Right? The one is actually through gentrification. So the one problem is, as I said to you, is that we're not supplying enough houses in the middle and upper end of the market, as well as into the affordable market as well. And hence, I repeat the point I made earlier, we have a housing problem. We don't just have an affordable housing problem. And so what happens is when you have households who can no longer afford to buy properties in those traditional middle and upper income suburbs, because that scarcity factor has pushed up the prices in those suburbs, what do? They move to the next best option. They do have buying power, and they move to the next best suburb that they can afford to buy a house in. So what we're seeing is we're seeing the movement of those houses into the neighboring suburbs around those middle and higher end areas of Cape Town. So for any of you who know Cape Town at all, areas such as Woodstock and Salt River, Muizenberg, Milton, all of those type of areas, we've seen dramatic increases in prices in those areas as middle income households move into those areas because they're unable to afford houses in the areas they traditionally would have gone and actually bought properties in. Now this creates a problem though, however, because not only when you have more middle income households moving into these areas, what that obviously does is it pushes up the prices. There's increased demand for those houses, prices go up. But usually when these people buy those houses, they actually then also invest in those properties as well. So they upgrade them, etc., and that further pushes up the prices of those properties. What that then does is it displaces a lot of the existing people who are living in those areas. So you get a displacement effect as a result of this gentrification. And it's estimated in Cape Town, we've probably lost about 60,000, over 60,000 well-located, affordable houses in those areas. And when I say lost, I mean those houses have filtered upwards from a price point of view and are no longer now affordable to the households that they used to be able to be, who used to be able to afford them. The other trend that we have seen and how the market is responding is we are starting to build much smaller units. So before we say, you know, your average size unit was 80 square meters plus, and now we're moving down to 60, 50, 40, and even down into sort of 20 and 15 square meter units, etc. Now, as somebody said to me, Rob, the lower income households or lower income and medium income households can actually afford relatively expensive housing. They just can't afford a lot of it. So actually, if you go and look at the square meter rates of these small micro units, and a square meter rate is actually quite a high rate, and it compares to the middle and upper income types of houses, but they're just buying fewer square meters of it, and that's making it more affordable. I think this is a global trend. If you speak to people who live in New York City or the Central Mile in London or any of those type of cities, all will argue that they're actually all staying in pretty small apartments, etc. There's been a bit of a pushback against this. Some people say that it's not right. I argue that if we do innovative design, and if these buildings are managed properly and that we design and we don't just use the three-dimensional space, the two-dimensional space, but we use three-dimensional space, etc., you can provide absolutely adequate housing in this form, as some of these photos actually show. The third response that's actually occurring is what is happening is people are renting out backyard units in the back of people's houses. And they're doing this for, there are a few drivers behind this. This is obviously generating an income for the household who owns the properties in the first place, etc., and is providing affordable accommodation in relatively well-located areas. However, again, as you can see from some of the pictures, a lot of this housing is inadequate, and you start to get massive problems around overcrowding, etc., in that space. The fourth response is what I'm calling is the redevelopment of the existing stock, existing housing stock. And I think this is a very exciting and quite positive trend that's happening within the city. Is what people are doing is they're taking existing properties and redeveloping and increasing the size of those properties, bulk of those properties, both horizontally and now increasingly vertically. And so this is a massive trend in Cape Town, and I suspect it's probably the #1 supplier of new formal housing stock in Cape Town at this point in time. So just in one of our suburbs alone, a large suburb in Cape Town known as SIAH, there's been over about 6,000 formal building plan applications for housing extensions in the space. It's happening across the board. It's happening across at the lower end, where you are seeing, I don't know if you can see my cursor here at all, but a really sort of basic structure like this, etc., being reconverted and redeveloped into something that looks like this, etc. So it's taking your existing structures and completely redeveloping this. For those of you who are in finance and business, etc., and want to understand the returns that you get are actually unbelievable, in fact, compared to other developments in Cape Town, and your initial yields on this are around about 40%. So you will get your money back. Your payback period on these type of developments is about 2 years. It's then happening at the more sort of middle to lower and middle income type of housing. So a lot of what we have in South Africa, we have the state's subsidized housing that is being provided. And a lot of these properties are being redeveloped into multi-story units and multi-units both within there, often rental, and they look at sort of redeveloping these units into somewhere between 4 and 12 rental units. Again, obviously your costs are slightly higher, so your yields are a bit lower, but very attractive yields. And just to give somebody a reference point with respect to those yields, your cost of finance in something around this is probably around about 14%. So you're paying 14% for the money, but you're receiving about 25% in return. And therefore, I'm not surprised that we've seen this massive proliferation of these type of housing units because they are so viable to produce. And then even at the higher end of the market, we're seeing exactly the same thing happen. Returns may not be as high, but they're still pretty attractive, considering that in this market, your cost of finance is probably sitting around about 9%, but you're getting a return of about 13 or 15%. So this is sort of one of the most dominant suppliers of housing into the market, and the way the market is responding to that value versus cost challenge that I was speaking about. I think it's quite important just to understand what I think is some of the advantages around this relatively new trend that we're seeing. First of all three of the previous slides I showed you the viability of these projects, and if projects are viable, you're likely to be able to roll them out at scale. Please notice that in none of those scenarios that I showed you was there a single state subsidy involved. So it's all private market driven bit responses. The reason why they are so viable is that you don't have to deal with a lot of those land production costs that I spoke about earlier, those which are major cost drivers in this space, right? One, the land has already been acquired and is owned already. You're able to, generally speaking, tap into existing infrastructure. You are using a lot of the existing structure itself, so you don't have your substructure, etc., costs, etc., associated with that. And in many cases, you're able to build smaller units on top of those existing units. Just with respect to some of the infrastructure issues, what's also quite an exciting prospect in the space is that when you redevelop those existing properties, you're able to get to the services in the house. So for instance, in my own house, I've tried to actually make my house more green, and I've tried to access some of the plumbing within the house, but some of those pipes are literally sitting under concrete in the roof, etc., and I haven't been able to access them. However, if I had to redevelop this house, I would be able to access a lot of the plumbing, and I could then introduce new forms of technology that are a lot greener, more efficient, etc., etc. So the use of grey water, the use of solar systems, etc., etc. So the impact that these new housing units have on the infrastructure in the city is a lot lower. And the other advantages then moving on is that where these housing developments are taking place, they're taking place within the existing urban footprint. So they're already close to existing amenities, schools, work opportunities, etc., etc. And what they're doing is they are increasing the densities in those locations, which makes our cities more efficient. Give you an example, it's estimated that you need, and this is a very generalized number, so it will vary from obviously from place to place. You need about 50 dwelling units or 50 houses per hectare before you can start to make public transport, etc., and that viable and efficient. In Cape Town, that number is 15. So we need to increase the densities within our existing footprint, and what I've just been showing you is exactly what has been going on. I've spoken about the opportunity to introduce new technologies, etc. And the last point that I also think about it is that by building and redeveloping and expanding our existing stock, our chances for social integration within our cities is so much higher as well, because a lot of that redeveloped stock will be rented out to people within the city, and you have higher levels of integration taking place. So just to finish off then, we need to understand this thing from a strategy point of view, etc. In the sense that what this does, it addresses some of that market failure, and it actually then addresses the segment of the market that is being so challenging, which is that 75% of the population who don't earn that 20,000 Rand a month, etc. And it is enabling us to bring down the cost side of that equation significantly so that we get that value versus cost equation right, etc. To give you an idea of the potential, we have about 450,000 single residential units in Cape Town. Now, if we had to just redevelop 25% of that, we could probably deliver about 100,000 houses within 1 year, because the redevelopment process will probably take between 3 to 6 months. And if you look back, and I said to you before, we're only developing somewhere between 5 and 10,000 houses a month, and that graph was going the wrong way. Well, here, if we looked at a situation like this, we could relatively easily put 100,000 units into the property market that are affordable to a large segment of the market as well. Are certain interventions that are required to achieve this? We obviously need to push up our infrastructure capacity. We need to reduce those development processes. So we need to make it as easy as possible for people to undertake these redevelopments, etc. We need to introduce a lot of innovation, both in terms of the type of materials we use, etc. So you're wanting to have light framed type of materials, etc. that for going up. The introduction of innovative technology, especially around some of the green technology, to reduce the impact on the infrastructure. From a financing point of view, we need to put finance products into the market so people are able to access finance in order to do these redevelopments. And because we're really developing small spaces, we need to make sure that our design are innovative, efficient, etc. In order to make this strategy appropriate to accommodate people in the city. So just to close off then, and I want to keep it short. I'm sure you want, from a time point of view, not to go on for too long, but obviously we're happy to take further questions. But just to sum up then, is that we have major challenges in our housing market in Cape Town. And if one stands back from that, I think one of the main drivers around that is that we are out of sync between the value and cost of properties in Cape Town. But I think it's not all doom and gloom. I think the market is actually starting to indicate us of ways in which we can overcome these hurdles. And I think that redevelopment of that existing stock, like I've shown, offers us a huge opportunity to address this problem. And in fact, it already is. We just need to be able to take it to another scale. So let me leave it at that. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Rob. It was very informative. I just have a 5-6 pages full of notes. So even for myself, I have to come and just attend your course. I had a chance to attend your course on 2016, but it's a lot of changes, especially for the COVID has happened. So yeah, please reserve a chair for me. If it's virtual or is it face-to-face, 100%, I'm just coming to your course and just do that one. So I'm not trying to summarize your presentation because we have a few minutes and we have a lot of compliment about your presentation and some few questions. So I just open the floor to everybody. Please raise your hand and just ask your question. So the first question we have it here is just from Jane. Jane, do you want to just ask your question? Jane? Jenny? No. So the second question, let's go very fast to the Sonia. Sonia, do you want to just ask your question personally?
Okay, I'll try. Thanks, Robert, for your presentation. I have a question of, you showed a model of housing in Cape Town, but I want to know, do you have a conceptual model of housing in Cape Town, formal versus informal, ownership types, something like that? That's an easy model. My guess is, does it follow the model, the apartheid model, the apartheid planning model? So then that brings me to the other question, which I posted lower down was, you know, I don't know a lot about finance, but do land costs contribute to a continuation of apartheid, and can this be changed by political will? And then finally, there's a Dutch architect that proposes this idea of flexible densities, which follows flexible, you know, fluctuations in family size, fluctuations in where people work, when, at different ages in their lives, and so on. And then can also cater for things like COVID, urban agriculture, livelihoods. That's my question. Thanks. 3 questions.
Thanks very much. Hopefully I can get to them. The in terms of the models and typologies in Cape Town, there's some work that's actually been done, and they've found about sort of 7 main typologies. Really, I think talking a lot in terms of the density from sort of low scale moving up. So there seems to be those sort of broad typologies. I think what we are seeing is a massive move to either reconversions of existing buildings, both residential and sort of office commercial buildings, so people moving into that space, and a lot of subdivision of existing houses and plots. So one house being, you know, knocked down, subdivided, and then, you know, 3 to 4 houses put on it, etc., going forward there. We are seeing greater degrees of integration in terms of breaking that apartheid model, but we've got a long way to go there. We're not out of the woods there by any stretch of the imagination, but we are seeing high levels of integration. Unfortunately, the state delivery model of housing. So in South Africa, you may know this, etc. I'm just, you know, the provision of subsidized houses to those households earning beneath a particular income level. There was a fixed subsidy amount for those houses, and they were trying to reach as many people as possible. In order to do that, in order to deal with the rising construction costs, etc., they had to increasingly look for, number one, cheaper land, and also large land parcels, because you could then achieve the economies of scale but reduce your costs that way. And unfortunately, what that meant is that a lot of these housing developments were built on the periphery of the city, which actually unintentionally reinforced that apartheid model. So hopefully through these processes, what I've just been showing to you now is a mechanism to try to reverse that trend. Moving on to around the design, I think that's an excellent idea, and I mean I would support that, because it's about choice that I think is very important in this housing space, and that is also one of the problems with the state subsidized model. It's a kind of one size fits all. So I think it's not just about, you know, numbers of units, it's how many households within units. And so often people have said it's actually better and more affordable to, for instance, supply larger units that can accommodate more than one household. So they have their own private space, but they have a lot of communal space, etc. as well. And with those type of units, what you can then have is, you can either have multiple households occupying that space, or but the need arises and the affordability arises, you can have one household occupying that space, and that creates that flexibility. So I think the notion and the principle around that flexibility is exactly spot on.
Yeah, thank you so much, Rob. There is a lot of question in the chat, so I'm not sure who wants to just raise his hand to just get the last question, because we have a few minutes. But the things I was also talking with you, Cecil, and the other colleague, one of the things we need to just look at here is just about the educating the people. You know, sometimes when you're just talking with the low income, they just thinking living in the high-rise building is a bad thing, or they don't have that kind of amenity, they don't have that kind of services, they can just get it from the townhouses or something like that. But when we just look at the that kind of the picture or the model, we have it in the East Asia, in the Europe, or in the US crowded city. The people, they just live in the CBD, very accessible in the high-rise building, and they just save a lot from the transportation, save a lot from, you know, the other things. They just try to do it and they can just afford in the safe, accessible place to just do that one. Helen, I can see your hand. Please ask your question.
Thanks very much. I'm not really, this is the first time I'm joining this chat, so I don't really know where you're coming from, but I'm very curious to know, because I've done quite a lot of subdivisions, add-ons, and I totally believe in where you're coming from. But you did have the township slide as one of your examples or one model. And just looking at townships, I'm close to the Tableview area where they regularly come in and pull down shacks. Those plots of land are regularly then sold on at about $3 a piece. There is nothing formalized. There are no formalities like they would be when you apply for building lines, departures, building plans. How do you propose bringing any kind of formalized structure? Obviously, nothing to do with bank loans. This is private money. How can you invest in any kind of add-ons or development of this nature when there's literally no structure? There's no formalities. I'm curious to know.
It's a great question, and you're probably referring to a lot of what's happening in Dunoon, where that process, actually, in fact, it's that sort of vertical redevelopment of plots, etc. I mean, it started out in Dunoon in a big way, and I've been tracking that since about 2011. And I think you're absolutely right. If it's not done properly, there are a lot of unintended consequences that occur with that as well. You can get large levels of overcrowding. You can overload the infrastructure system, and not just the infrastructure in terms of the pipes, etc., but there are things like schools, clinics, etc., all of those sort of things that have to be taken into account as well. And then there's just the general health and safety aspects of that. I mean, if you look at some of those structures, clearly, highly problematic, etc. So what my approach to this has been is that in principle, it's a good thing. So don't outlaw it, rather work with it and deal with those type of issues, etc., because it is a major supply of housing in Cape Town. And we've seen some very good examples actually elsewhere in the city, for instance, in Khayelitsha, where the town planning branch there took a very proactive role. And what they did is they said, in principle, this is a good thing, but there are certain criteria that have to be met before we will permit this to take place. And those included things like, they said basically the structural integrity of the house is non-negotiable. In other words, it needs to be safe, etc. Public safety, especially in terms of fires, etc. And that was very important. Building lines, in other words, so you're not actually now moving on to but your neighbor's plots, etc., in that process. And which I think are good, sensible kind of requirements. But they didn't get caught up in the sort of bureaucratic nitpicking around some of these issues, etc. And they said as long as those main big picture issues were resolved, they were happy to support it. They also facilitated the process by making it very easy to get building plans approved, and would actually assist in improving the design of a building when somebody brought in their plan to highlight how that building could be improved from a health and safety point of view, etc. But on the other side of the coin, they did close down building sites that weren't compliant. So there was a sort of a carrot, making it as sort of easy as possible on the one level, but on the other hand, making sure there was a stick that if people didn't actually comply. And as a result, we've had over 6,000 building plan applications in the Khayelitsha area for these consolidations that we've actually seen. And if you just take a drive around places like Elita Park, etc., you will see that the quality of these products is actually excellent for the most part. There are the exceptions, but I think it's the Khayelitsha example is sort of working with it and fixing some of the problems, rather than pushing back and sort of outlawing it completely. So I think they're handy with it.
Thank you so much for answering my question. I really appreciate it. I'm just also curious to know how you can apply for plans when there is no earth number and these are not governed by title deeds or normal formal ownership to the deeds office. You have answered my question, and I'm sure there's no more time, but that would be linked to my first question.
Absolutely. And funny enough, just to say, so there is a transaction support a center that actually has been done with the Center for Affordable Housing Finance in Kalecha, has been set up to try to deal with a lot of those issues where people, for instance, haven't been given title deeds, etc., etc. So you do have to get those systems in place to facilitate these type of approval. So you're absolutely right. There are a number of preconditions and building blocks to be put in place in order for this type of strategy to actually work. But I think we've got, what's really nice is we have an example of one where it's working to a large degree. Always room for improvement, but it is definitely working for a large degree in one part of our city. And the city is looking to roll that out to the other areas now as well.
Okay, thank you so much, Sonia. Yes, just go for the last question.
Ali, I'm just returning to your question, Rob. High rises.
Yes.
That was part of the flexible density question. Can you speak to that, please?
So look, I think you get high rises and you get high rises. So I think it's the extent to which one is actually speaking about it. I think there's a lot of positives with respect to high rise buildings from an efficiency point of view and from a viability point of view. However, it is critical that they are properly managed. We've seen you always have a problem when they're not properly managed. You end up with highly problematic buildings from all kinds of social ailments, etc., that go with that, which is often why the rental market works better in a high-rise building than an ownership market. I'm not saying you shouldn't have an ownership option, but generally speaking, a rental option is better because you have one landlord who's able to then manage that building. And if you look at a lot of the stock in the inner city of Johannesburg, etc., where you have investors who own 3,000-4,000 units, etc., they put in place very stringent management conditions. So access control to buildings, etc., that type of thing going forward. From a point of view of households themselves, I think it's about choice and trade-off. I mean, I've heard all kinds of things about people in South Africa don't like living in high-rise buildings, etc. And I say to them, well, that's strange, because the last time I drove through Hillbrow, there were a lot of South African people living in high-rise buildings there and choosing to live in those buildings as opposed to living in Orange Farm or some area on the outskirts of the city. So I think it's a trade-off, and the trade-off is that you get much better accessibility and access to urban amenities. But on the other hand, you're trading off the amount of space you get, etc., etc. Critical to all of this, and I keep coming back to this point, the building itself needs to be managed properly, but the area, the precincts around those buildings need to be managed properly. And in the sense, your public spaces become very important there. Your public spaces and your public amenities become critical when you're putting people into those kind of higher rise situations.
Yeah, you are just a very good point, Rob, here. I'm just living 20 years in the high-rise building in East Asia and the Europe. So I'm living in the 60-story building and something like that. So I just realized all the points you just highlighted about the precinct of the that kind of high-rise building. If you are not manage the high-rise building, the common area will be just like a war. We have a lot of conflict on that one. I just sitting as a facility manager for the 4 high-rise building in Manila, Philippines. So I just know what you are just talking about, and the conflict between the neighbors, conflict between the owners, and something like that. But definitely that's the solution. We have to try that one and just go to just try to solve those problems. And we just try to train and educate those facility managers to just come and just take a role of that one. We have a lot of good example of the high-rise building, as you just highlighted, even in the South Africa, but is in the higher market. So we need to just bring it into the middle and low market to just give them the people that kind of accessibility. If I want to
can I just add something on that? I mean, I think that model I was showing you about the redevelopment of that existing stock, I think one of the reasons why I like it is that it does deal with this management issue slightly, because it's one thing, if you've got a building that's got 100 units in it or 150 units going up to 10, 15, 20 floors. I mean, that's a major management headache, if I can call it that. I mean, that's a major challenge. But if you're doing a redevelopment, and as I say, they're developing, maybe it's 4 to 12 units onto a site, it's much easier for a landlord who's often living on that site to manage 4 units or 5 units. So you remove some of that management issue. And I think we do need to increase our densities, but it doesn't mean that every building has to be 25 stories tall. You know, if we can convert a single story building and we can go to a 2 to 3 story building, we will achieve huge number of positive outcomes just on the back of that. So it doesn't mean that every building has to be a skyscraper.
No, you're just 100% right. Based on the zoning, we have some like a high-rise building, and we have just like a low-rise building somewhere. So that's just try to balance the urban planning and the zoning. That's you're 100% right. So if I just try to close this workshop and just highlight the very critical point you just highlighted is about the innovation. Not innovation only in one aspect of the housing. Innovation from the first one, which is just a process. We have a lot of research. We just try to look at the blockchain or those innovative technology, how we can just facilitate and transparent the process and just make it faster and remove those red tapes or overlapping process. We have that one. So it's just massive research is just happening in South African University. I know in the BEADS, in the UCT, in the UJ, we just try to do that one, to use those innovative technology for the processing of the house from the very early, from the initiation stage to end of that one, using the BIM building information modeling to keep all the those informations. The other things we just try to do it. You highlighted about the innovative in design and flexibility, which just Sonia you just explained, and we are just enjoy about this kind of conversation about the flexibility. Even the Gonzalo from the Canada, he just highlighted that one. You know, we can just provide like a half of the house, and when the people they have the money, they can expand it vertically or horizontally to just expand it for their self or for their rent or something like that. So we need to just look at that kind of innovative design or innovative method in the housing design, and also in the construction or in the operation of the building. I see a lot of kind of conversation happening about the alternative building method is just happening, or innovative technology, which we just try to answer this kind of question in the next workshop to see is the 3D printing is the solution for the South Africa housing market. Is the modular prefabrication, it can be solved this kind of the problem or something like that, or no, it's just make it more expensive and it's just maybe some social issue. So we just encourage those people that are interested to just continue this kind of conversation, join us in the next workshop, which is just the next Wednesday. And we have an excellent speaker, just go through those kind of innovative technology. And you can just hear about the 50 houses, which we just try to print it in the KwaZulu-Natal in a few months. So it's approved, the process is just going and the technology is here. So it's better to just adopt ourselves to this kind of technology to just understand what's happening. Once again, I want to appreciate your time, Rob. I know you are very busy. You have a lot of things, you have a lot of commitments, but you just sharing a fantastic presentation and information with us. As I say, I just have lots of notes and I just added to my research and my project. And please reserve a place for me in your courses.
Sure.
So
thank you very much for having me.
Pleasure. And I want to also thank you all of the participants, all the people they just found the time to just joining us this afternoon. Please support us for the next few workshops we have it, and also put your team together for the competition. It is a lot of good things, is a lot of nice things is coming during this competition, which we just try to learn together, not only the participant, also as a organizer, as a jury, we just try to learn from yourself, and maybe one of these design is just selected as a most sustainable, innovative, affordable house for the Africa, and we can just produce it and we just try to expand that. So thank you everybody, and I just try to close this meeting, but the record will be available on the SIAH this afternoon, and all the presentation of the Rob will be also available in the SIAH website. Thank you, and see you in next workshop.
Thanks very much, Ali. Cheers everybody.